Hello, and welcome to Sonata She Wrote. This week is going to be an examination of the medieval musical mind. And by that I mean, we are going to be taking a look at one of the most important writers, or possibly philosopher is a better word, regarding music and its academic study in the medieval world, Isidore of Seville. Isidore of Seville was the Bishop of Seville in the early Christian Church and lived from the 560s to 636 CE. He is often nicknamed the last philosopher of the ancient world. Even though his life and death dates are from the early Middle Ages, he has this nickname because of his enduring encyclopedia, the Etymologies, or the Origin of Words, which was comprised of summaries of several ancient world texts. This encyclopedia was widely used as an academic resource in the medieval world, but fell out of use in the early modern period. Generally, the source is similar to our modern concept of an encyclopedia, in that it provides a more or less brief overview of a topic, concept, or piece of writing. In fact, it was apparently so popular as a source that, for the generalist, which the medieval scholar typically was, it supplanted some of the documents which it summarized, leading to the originals being copied less than the etymologies. The structure of this video is going to first be a brief biography of the early life and context of Isidore of Seville and his education, an examination of the section in the Etymologies regarding music, Book 3, that generally reflect the medieval mindset regarding music, and a brief examination of an Old Hispanic Chant, sometimes mistakenly referred to as Mozarabic Chant. To begin with Isidore, who is now Saint Isidore, he was likely born in Cartagena, a Spanish city on the east coast named after Carthage, before his family moved to Seville. Most of the Iberian Peninsula was, at this time, ruled by the Visigoths, and their reigning period is generally defined as being very unstable. Any number of coastal raids or power plays would have been the background of Isidore's early life. In Seville, Isidore was educated at the cathedral school and also by his older brother, Leander, who was roughly 30 years older than Isidore and preceded him in the post of Bishop of Seville. The subjects taught at the medieval cathedral school in Spain were similar to what was taught at all schools and universities in medieval Europe, what we now refer to as the Trivium and Quadrivium, in addition to learning to speak, read, and write, at least Latin and Greek. This is the origin of our educational system and its quote-unquote obsession with the memorization of information. This made sense in a time when it was extremely difficult to store information. The pages of a single Bible required the skin of over 300 calves, which you likely also needed for labor and/or food. But it arguably makes much less sense today when the storage and access of information should be much easier. The issue with describing Isidore's education as being related to the Trivium and Quadrivium is that these terms were not in common usage until the Carolingian Empire, which, of course, didn't exist during Isidore's life. But because many of the subjects are pillars of the classical education system laid out in Plato's Republic, it is probable that they were the subjects he learned as well. The Trivium is the lower level of the 7 liberal arts and is comprised of grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Grammar is similar to our concept of grammar today, the mechanics of language, but it also likely included an element of terminology and definitions. Logic, a particular obsession of medievals, can be defined in a medieval sense as the process of composing sound arguments and identifying fallacies, and thereby systematically removing contradictions, thereby producing factual knowledge that can be trusted. Of course, the issue with logic is that it is generally weaponized in the form of debate, or what the medievals would have called rhetoric, the skill of using the mechanics of language, grammar, and logic to express clear and concise arguments. The issue with debate, of course, being that one may be completely wrong and still, quote-unquote, win a debate. This isn't a problem specific to the medieval period. One needs to look no farther than almost anywhere on the internet to find a reply guy or debate bro. Interesting how it's associated with the male gender. The Quadrivium, the upper level of the 7 liberal arts, are arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. As I said, the use of the terms Trivium and Quadrivium may not have been the way this curriculum was referred to, but this is an educational curriculum outlined by Plato. If you don't know, Plato is an ancient Greek philosopher, And although ancient Greek philosophy may seem to some like a complex field with too high of a barrier for entry, think of it as self-help for Greeks, and that makes the field much more approachable. Epicurus is a particular favorite of mine. Back to the quadrivium, the study of arithmetic is the study of numbers. Geometry is the study of number in space, music, number in time, and astronomy, number in space and time. If you're confused, don't worry, everyone is. Unfortunately, we'll only be diving deeper into the academic subject of music. In the medieval mind, these subjects formed inseparable aspects of a whole. But we aren't medieval. We're modern. So let's go ahead and chop off what we're interested in and/or specialize in. The medieval subject of music has only a passing relationship to the performance of music, but it did inform medieval music theory. Unlike today, where music theory generally aims to describe music which has already been written, medieval music theory was more like a guide for composition. So, let's get into a translated edition of some of Book 3 of the Etymologies. On the origin of music, Isidore writes that Moses says that the inventor of the art of music was Tubal, who was of the race of Cain before the flood. The Greeks say that Pythagoras found its beginnings in the sound of hammers and the striking of stretched strings. If we think Moses a real person or credible source, that places the invention of music around 5,500 to 6,000 years ago. Pythagoras is a more secure historical figure to point to, and lived roughly 2,500 years ago in ancient Greece. Of course, in reality, music has probably existed for as long as there have been conscious, intelligent beings on Earth. Early prehistoric instruments, such as flutes made of bone or wood, date back as far as 35,000 years ago. And that doesn't tell us anything about the origin of the voice and its use for music, which likely extends several tens of thousands of years farther back. Pythagoras, however, is probably where we can say that the ideas used in medieval music began, particularly the study of harmonics. In brief, Pythagorean harmony is all about ratios and intervals which we still use today, the main ones being the perfect intervals of the octave, fifth, and fourth. To achieve an octave, one must simply divide a vibrating object, in this case a string, into two, making the ratio for an octave 2 to 1. In modern terms, the pitch A, in the US generally at 440 Hz, is an octave higher at 880 Hz, and an octave lower at 220 Hz. The question of whether A880 and A220 would be in tune with each other is a separate matter. A perfect fifth is achieved by dividing a vibrating string into thirds and allowing the largest portion to vibrate. The ratio for a perfect fifth is thus 2 to 3. The final perfect interval, a fourth, can be found by dividing the string into fourths and again sounding the larger portion of the string, making the ratio for a perfect fourth 3 to 4. Although these harmonic ratios do get more complicated, especially when one tunes fixed pitch instruments and quickly realizes that stacking intervals of octaves on top of each other will cause an octave spread and make everything out of tune, this is a simplified view of harmony and one which would have been commonly known amongst medieval monastic musicians. In the Etymologies, Isidore describes 3 parts of music: the harmonic, what distinguishes between high and low sounds; the rhythmic, that which inquires whether words in combination sound well or badly together; and the metric, that by which valid reasoning knows the measure of various meters. The examples given are poetic meters, such as iambic or heroic. Within each of these 3 parts, there are 3 other divisions: another harmonic, the organic, and also the rhythmic. First, the harmonic. Isidore's concept of harmonic includes what we would refer to as melody, but his first definition is the modulation of the voice. I'll save you the agony of me reading this whole passage aloud, but you can pause here if you would like to read Isidore's own words. To summarize, he goes on to describe consonant harmony, which he calls euphonious, dissonant harmony, diaphony, diastema, the combination of 2 or more sung intervals, and key, the raising or lowering of certain pitches within a scale depending on the referential starting and ending pitch, what we today also refer to as keys or modes. The second division is the organic. Again, you can pause if you would like to read, but by organic, Isidore is referring to instruments which create sound by the movement of air, the human voice, various wind instruments, and the organ itself. Of course, we know now that all sound is created by vibrations moving through the air. When a string vibrates, the sound we hear is the air which sympathetically vibrates with the string. A violin in a vacuum makes no sound at all. Isidore's third division of music is the rhythmic, which has to do with strings which are plucked rhythmically, or struck instruments, struck rhythmically. Again, you can pause now to read Isidore's description of various medieval instruments. The final section in the source reading is in regards to musical numbers. This is in reference to the Pythagorean ratios we discussed earlier, and Isidore is setting forth formulas to reach each of these ratios. However, Isidore has made a mistake in his math. He's really copying Boethius, an early medieval Roman philosopher, and his text, The Fundamentals of Music. Again, you can pause to read, the note has the corrected math, but these are simply formulas for finding the above harmonic relationships. On to some actual music. The chant that Isidore of Seville would have concerned himself with is commonly referred to as Mozarabic Chant, because it was originally thought to be the chant used in Christian worship when the Iberian Peninsula was under Islamic rule. Interesting to note that Islamic rulers generally allowed the worship of other religions in the lands that they ruled. They did not consider conversion, quote, by the sword, unquote, to be a valid form of religious conversion, unlike Charlemagne. Mozarabic is really a misnomer because we know now that this chant precedes Islamic occupation by several centuries. In fact, it's so old that hardly any of it exists in a notation which is readable. We have only a handful of chant examples in Aquitanian notation, a type of diastematic early notation which is readable, as an example of Old Hispanic Chant, which is really a proper name for it. Although the chant is not entirely dissimilar from Roman or Carolingian chant, an example is now on the screen, you might notice that it has a generally wider melodic range and is slightly more melismatic than early examples of Carolingian chant tend to be, which is interesting as this Old Hispanic chant is from a much earlier period, the 5th and 6th centuries CE. This is also a notable part of the early unreadable nomadic notated chants we have of this same corpus. They tend to be much more florid than other European styles of chant. Writing in the Cambridge Handbook to Medieval Music, Nicholas Bell states that the gradual suppression of the Spanish rite in favor of Roman was generally brought about through new liturgical books using Aquitanian notation. Though a few examples survive from the time of transition of manuscripts of the new rite using the old notation, the extent to which Spanish plain chant demonstrated uniformity across the country and remained true to its Roman sources in succeeding centuries is not a subject that has yet received much attention. There were certainly national and local characteristics in particular liturgical forms, some of which are likely to be a legacy from the old rite. For example, though the majority of hymn texts found in the Spanish kingdoms were widely disseminated in other countries, almost 2/3 of the melodies are not generally known outside the peninsula. Many of these are likely to be native compositions, and some are probably remnants of the old Spanish rite. So you can see that Hispanic chant was homogenized into Roman chant in much the same way as in the Carolingian Empire, mainly to consolidate the power of that empire. Unfortunately, as Bell states, we just don't have enough information regarding how this chant may have varied regionally or nationally. We barely have any evidence as to how it might have sounded in the first place. My goal with this lecture was to show how music, specifically music written for the church, was viewed so differently by the medieval mind. The medieval scholar's music theory may seem to have little to do with music as it was sung in church, and in some ways that is true. as the music was probably made by cantors and not those who had composed it, but chant was generally composed by religious scholars and musicians at the time, and this would have been their basis in musical training. It's also interesting to see what a large part of this involved instruments. The use of instruments in the performance of medieval music is controversial and has no clear standard practice, but if we take Isidore at his word, instruments were clearly involved in the making of music in some way. In short, the medieval musical mind is so far removed from how the modern mind perceives and makes music that much of this just seems unnecessary. But it wouldn't have seemed so to them. In fact, it's interesting to note that to the medieval scholar, musicians today would seem to have almost no education at all. What modern musician do you know who is fluent in Latin and Greek, who has mastered geometry, arithmetic, astronomy, and medieval music theory? I can think of a handful of academics who specialize in this study, but I doubt any of them holds all this information entirely in their own head, as the medieval scholar would have done. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the medieval mind. If you enjoyed it, please consider joining my Patreon at patreon.com/sonatashewrote. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave a comment, or you can email me with any suggestions for topics or comments about the lecture. As always, please like and subscribe.